Ah, this alternate history. I once read that half of all alternate history books published were about what if the Nazis had won World War II, and I actually believe it. This is the one alternate history everyone cares at least a little bit about. I always preferred what if the South won the Civil War alternate histories, but I'm just a minor YouTuber, so my opinion doesn't matter. World War II alternate histories are always annoying to make because everyone thinks they're an expert. You see, when I talk about 17th century Mexico or the crisis of the 3rd century, people will just assume I know what I'm talking about because so few people care. However, with World War II, people are willing to shove forth the most bigoted and ignorant opinions and assume anyone who thinks otherwise is Satan. World War II elicits such emotion in people because it's so recent and was so bloody. This comment section is probably going to be horrible. In another sense, it entirely makes sense. World War II was the bloodiest war in world history, spanned 4 continents, and had larger-than-life personalities like Stalin, Hitler, Churchill, Tojo, Mao, and Roosevelt. The Nazis were just so evil and came so close to conquering Europe that it begs the question, what if they did win? What would borders, culture, and demographics look like if the unimaginable did occur? That is a question of this alternate history. There are countless ways the Nazis could have won the Second World War. I'm going to pick 2 separate points of departure, or places to change history from. The reason Europe has never been united is that to do so, one must conquer both the British Isles and the massive titan that is Russia, which turns out to be impossible. Hitler faced this issue. At the height of his power, he couldn't defeat either Britain or Russia, and that destroyed him. So, for this timeline to work, we need to change that. The first point of departure is in Russia. It was late fall of 1941, and the Germans were driving towards the Russian capital, Moscow. In our timeline, the Germans were able to fight to the city's suburbs, some detachments actually seeing the spires of the Kremlin. The Russians then launched an incredible counterattack that drove the Germans from the city. They're able to do this for a very important reason. The Russians kept large reserves in the Far East for fear that the Japanese would invade Siberia. However, the Russian spy in Tokyo informed them that Japan was not planning an attack, thus allowing them to move their reserves west to protect Moscow. The elite Siberian regiments were able to turn the tide of battle. The Nazis were pushed back and Moscow was saved. In this timeline, that does not happen. There is no transfer of troops from Siberia, and the Germans are able to drive into Moscow. The Russians move their capital to Kazan and keep the fight going, however. In our timeline, the Russians counterattacked the Germans in the winter of early 1942. However, these attacks were mostly ineffectual. The Russians were able to seize some of the countryside to the west of Moscow, but the Germans held on to all the towns. This was because Stalin purged up to 80% of the officer corps in 1939, meaning the leadership in the Soviet military was terrible. Leadership is more important in offense than in defense. Thus, in the first years of the war, the Russians were able to offer weak defensive operations but were utterly abysmal in the offense. Just like our timeline, the only thing the Russian winter offensive of 41-42 would accomplish would be many dead Russians, with the Germans still holding on to Moscow. Hitler was worried in 1942 that the Nazis would run out of oil. This actually turned out to be wrong, since synthetic oil production really picked up in Germany later in the war, but that's besides the point. He planned on striking into southern Russia, seizing the oil fields of the Caucasus. In our timeline, the Germans went after Stalingrad, the city on the Volga River that was the hinge to the Caucasus in the south. A great battle was fought there that eventually broke the back of the German army and resulted in the turning of the tide of the war. The Russians were able to win this battle because they had been collecting troops on the Volga River for a massive offensive in the winter of 1942-43, which drove the Germans back into the Ukraine. In this timeline, however, the Russians would expend their reserves into an offensive to reconquer Moscow. Moscow would have such symbolic and central importance to the Soviet Union that they would expend a huge amount of effort into retaking it. As mentioned earlier, the Russians were terrible at offensives at this stage of the war, meaning they would lose. However, all the effort that would go into Moscow offensives would take reserves away from the southern front. The counterattack at Stalingrad would be significantly weaker, and the Germans would fight it off. The Germans would be able to seize control of the Caucasus. The Caucasus would give the Germans vital oil fields. This would move the front away from Ukraine, which became the main battlegrounds in 1943. This would allow the Germans access to the farmlands of Ukraine, the richest in Europe, to supply themselves with food. With this food and oil, Germany would become entirely self-sufficient, and Russia significantly weaker. The second point of departure for this alternate history is that Hitler never declares war on America. Americans tend to gloss over how the Germans were the ones that actually declared war on the Americans and not vice versa. For the first 2 years of the war, the United States was neutral, and President FDR wanted to get the U.S. into the war, but the Congress was against it, and in America, Congress has control over war and peace. The United States entered the war when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and declared war on the United States. In the next few days, Hitler declared war on the United States as well. This was an unbelievably stupid decision in retrospect. The United States was the largest economy and industrial nation on Earth. The United States did a huge part of winning the war against the Germans. Hitler believed that, firstly, due to all the ethnic interbreeding, the Americans were a mongrel people with little military skill. One of his leading generals said America was a nation of razor makers, not soldiers. Secondly, he believed war with America was inevitable and made the judgment that keeping the alliance with Japan was more valuable than starting a war with America. In reality, the alliance with Japan gave Germany nothing in World War II, and the Japanese never declared war on Russia, while Russia was Germany's main enemy, meaning that probably nothing would have changed in this timeline. Japan and Germany's relation would be strained but would remain on friendly terms, but in either case, it wouldn't matter. The United States would be involved in his war with Japan. Most Americans viewed Japan as the main enemy after Pearl Harbor, and would feel that they should direct their energies against it. If you told Americans in this alternate history that in our world, America simultaneously beat both the Japanese and the Germans, they would probably give you a blank stare and call you insane. Also, the most populated electorally important states in America, the Midwest and Pennsylvania, had huge numbers of people of German descent who wouldn't really want a war with the Germans without knowing how evil Hitler was beforehand. In this timeline, the United States fights the war against Japan alone. Like our timeline, the Americans still beat the Japanese. Without 80% of America's industry going towards the war in Europe, the war in Japan progresses faster. The Americans invade the Japanese home islands in 1944, and a brutal campaign follows, ending with the atomic bomb being dropped on the strongest resisting Japanese cities in 1945, thus resulting in an armistice. With the Russians busy having their stomachs getting torn out by the Germans, the Americans would be able to pilfer the entire Japanese empire. The entirety of Korea would fall under an American-style capitalist regime. The Russians would be a complete non-entity in China, meaning that the Red Chinese wouldn't be able to get the massive amounts of help they did from them in our timeline, and so the nationalists would become dominant in China. With Holland and France conquered by the Nazis, the Americans would turn Indonesia and Vietnam into independent capitalist states. Nasty communist insurgencies would exist in Vietnam and Malaysia just like in our timeline. Britain would be in a very tough position. As of 1942, Britain had won the Battle of Britain, and there was no imminent fear of invasion. The Germans were putting almost all of their effort into Russia, and did not have any of the naval ability to invade the British Isles. However, Britain was being starved to death. Britain needs to import food from the outside world to survive. The German submarines were destroying the convoys coming from the Americas with resources at a horrific clip. In our timeline, it took the massive investment, effort, and industry of the Americans to make the issue even somewhat manageable. For Britain alone, there would be no hope. Britain would be slowly strangled by the German submarines. By the end of 1942, Winston Churchill would be forced to make peace with the Nazis. As the Germans would seize the important cities of Russia, the idea of ever beating the Germans would become more and more hopeless. Hitler thought the English another Aryan people, and so would give them a relatively reasonable treaty. It would involve the recognition of Vichy France, the Nazi puppet, as the real France, and thus giving it all its colonies. This would involve the transfer of a truly massive region, mainly in West Africa. It would also involve the return of Germany's pre-World War I colonies. Hitler actually really didn't care about Africa, thinking it was unhealthy for the Aryan master race, but thought this was important for Germany's dignity as a nation. The Belgian Congo, with Belgium no longer a nation, would be given as a German colony, forming a convenient bridge between the old German colonies in Tanzania and Cameroon across Central Africa. The Dutch, German, and French colonies in Southeast Asia and New Guinea would be under America's influence, and the Americans would give the Germans a firm "screw you" when they would be asked to be given as colonies. Britain would immediately become an American puppet state. It would be faced with a hostile Europe and so would turn to its colonies and its cousin across the ocean, America, for survival and trade. American grain would keep Britain afloat. Britain would always be able to count on America for loans to survive and to be able to trade with the Americans. The United States would meanwhile prize having a foothold in an otherwise hostile European continent. The war in Russia would drag on. The Germans would control the western heartland of Russia, but Russia is so frickin' huge that pushing any further would be impossible. The distance from the German border to Moscow is roughly the same from Chicago to New York or from London to Barcelona. The fact that the Germans got that far in the first place is incredible. The Germans would try to drive for Kazan or Archangel and fail. The Russians, with much of their heartland ripped out, would however be unable to drive the Germans out. Hitler's strongest fantasy was the complete conquest of all of European Russia, and he would not stop until this plan would come to fruition. Meanwhile, the Russians would not stand to have genocidal maniacs in control of much of their homeland, and would fight forever to liberate them. The war would drag on into the 50s, at which point both sides would become nuclear, and they would realize that they preferred what they had to destroying half of the northern hemisphere in a fiery blaze. This is what the world would look like in 1960. The United States dominates the Americas, the British Empire, and the Pacific. The Nazis control much of Europe and the large chunks of Africa. Nations like Sweden, Turkey, and Spain have become strong German allies. The Soviet Union is still a massive country, stretching from the Volga to the Pacific. The Soviet Union at this point would turn in on itself. It would become a massive North Korea, a huge militaristic, isolationist, and paranoid totalitarian state. Russia just experienced a near-fatal attack from the outside, meaning that the Soviet Union would cut off almost all contact with the outside world. Russia's main connector with the rest of the world is through Europe, which would be controlled by the Nazis, making this not difficult. It would maintain a massive military for fear of the next Nazi invasion. There would be massive migration of Russians into Asia for fear of the next attack. The stands would become an integral part of Russia. Russia's heartland would become the Siberian wheat belt, and the capital would become Novosibirsk. This would mean that the two main global powers would be the Americans and Germans. It would be a Cold War and at the same time not. There would be significant military and political competition. However, both nations had relatively capitalist economies and so would trade with each other, and both nations would view themselves as the descendants and height of Western civilization. It would be actually kind of similar to what America's relationship with China is becoming in our world. The US trades with China, but there is always the impending threat of horrifying war in the background. With Russia out of the picture, the Americans would be able to crush communism all over the world. The US would reinvade Cuba without the Russians to threaten the Americans not to do so. Vietnam might still be communist, being the badass warrior people they are. In that case, they'd be the weird exception of that one communist country that isn't Russia. Behind Nazi walls, really horrific things would be happening. One of the biggest parts of Hitler's Nazi philosophy was the planned extermination of the Slavic population of Eastern Europe. Hitler wanted to create a frontier for the Germans in the same way the Americans got their frontier, or how the British and the French got their 90 gajillion colonies. This would and wouldn't work at the same time. Firstly, lots of Slavs did die in the 6 years of World War II in our timeline. The Nazis would certainly kill a large number of people and commit one of the worst atrocities in history. Large lands in Eastern Europe would become opened up for German settlers. They would take the most fertile lands, like large parts of Ukraine and central Poland. However, the numbers simply don't add up. Let's look at Hitler's American comparison. The Americas before Europeans probably had something on the order of 70 million inhabitants. However, 90% of that was wiped out by disease, meaning only 7 million natives were left in the entire Americas around 1600. That's less people than Manhattan and the boroughs of New York today in our world. Most of this was centered in areas like Mesoamerica, the Caribbean, and Peru. This meant there were probably less than 1 million inhabitants in the United States before the Anglos arrived. Meanwhile, the area the Nazis planned on exterminating had a population of 150 million. All of World War II killed 60 million people, and the next two, Mao and Genghis Khan, rank at 40 million. Hitler and the radicals around him were the only people who really wanted to exterminate the Slavs. The officers who ran the military were of noble Prussian ancestry, living on lands carved out against the Slavs in the Middle Ages by the Teutonic Knights. They wanted to have the Slavs work as tenant slave labor. The truth is that most people don't want to be free farmers, building a farm out of nothing and working with their bare hands. They want to be lords. After realizing simply how many Slavs there were, the Germans would become a ruling class with the Slavs as slave labor. It would be remarkably like apartheid South Africa, the antebellum American South, or colonial Latin America. The Slavs would be uneducated, subjugated slaves, and the Germans would be a martial asshole aristocrat class. This is actually quite similar to the Mongols, who started out wanting to exterminate the farming peoples like the Chinese and Persians, but realizing how many of them there were, and how nice it was not to work, became a ruling class. Sadly, Europe's Jews wouldn't have much of a chance. With many more years, the Nazis would eradicate the last of them in the concentration camps. Africa would become another nasty story. Like Eastern Europe, the Nazis would become a ruling class, living on massive plantations. The exception would be Namibia, which is a relatively non-malarial climate, and the Germans planned on settling it and making it majority white before World War I. They had already exterminated the majority Herero tribe before World War I, and so the land was relatively lightly settled. The Nazis would settle it and Namibia would become a majority white nation. Why? Another horrifying side effect would be that racism would be much more acceptable in the world outside Nazi Germany. The truth is that philosophy is based in the outside world, and the philosophy of whatever is the dominant nation will seem to be chosen by God and correct. An example of this is that Mao killed more people than either Hitler or Stalin, but China is the world's second largest economy and America's biggest trading partner, so you don't hear much about him. Racism was discredited because the world powers that used racism, aka Germany, Japan, and to a much lesser extent Britain and the other colonial powers as their main ideology, lost power to the democratic and communist nations. Decolonization and the civil rights movement happened at the same time because racism was discredited on the battlefield a decade or two beforehand. In this timeline, with the Soviet Union being economically irrelevant and having had the western half of its heart torn out, would mean that communism would be seen as a bullshit philosophy. There wouldn't be a plethora of left-wing insurgents in the Third World, and there wouldn't be a hard-left academic/artsy fringe in democracies. In this timeline, the fight would be between democratic, individualistic, and fascist, racist ideologies. This would mean that things like the civil rights movement, or possibly the entire cultural revolution of the 60s, would be delayed for a very long time. Nazism openly advocated sexism, while both communism and democracy were against it, meaning feminism would likely be greatly delayed in this timeline. We would start to see strange alliances develop with the Nazis. The Argentines have a large chip on their shoulder from being the whitest people in South America, but also being a poor, messed up nation. They had Nazi tilts in our timeline, so they'd likely become Nazi allies in this world. Paraguay has a large German ancestral component, and has a history of attacking all of its neighbors, fighting valiantly, and then getting crushed. Remind you of anyone? So let's throw them in. South Africa's apartheid is also too similar to the Nazi ideology. In 1947, in our timeline, the Anglos lost control of the government to the Dutch Afrikaners, which would probably trigger a change of allegiances from the British to the Germans in this timeline. Finally, Iran. The Iranians were having Nazi tilts in our timeline in the 1930s because they were technically an Aryan nation. They'd be close to Nazi-allied Turkey, as well as they'd want to have a counterweight to the British presence in Iraq and the Soviets in Turkestan, alongside wanting to drive out the British oil companies that controlled Iran's oil. An interesting side effect of this would be that the British Empire would never decolonize, partially because racism would still be seen as a viable ideology, but also the Americans would know that if they decolonized, the Germans would just invade the new colonial nations in Africa or the Near East with their racist manifest destiny ideology, and so the Americans would prop the empire up. India is an exception. The British promised it independence during the war, and with its massive 300 million man population, it would be hard to hold. India would become a neutral nation in the Cold War, just like in our timeline. Kenya and possibly Rhodesia would probably end up with a sizable white British population if the pre-war migration numbers kept up. The United States, being an ex-British colony itself, would try to slowly move the British Empire towards greater and greater autonomy. Perhaps a prescient example is modern France, who never really gave up its colonial influence. The economies of West Africa are based around a currency based in Paris. France bails out the regimes when they get into too much trouble, and France is currently waging an underground war in Chad, Mali, and Niger. China would immediately become an economic superpower. In our timeline, once China became capitalist, it immediately had a massive economic boost and rose to become the world's second largest economy. With the communists defeated, Chiang Kai-shek would crush the warlords in the same way as Mao did, and start to turn China capitalist. Imagine how big China's economy would be with a 40-year head start. After a certain point, China would become a world power in its own right and dominate the politics of the region, becoming another world player. I'm not sure when or how this would happen. American trade policy determines a lot, and this video is already getting unimaginably long and complex, so I'll leave it there. The general assumption for most of these what if Germany won alternate histories is that the Nazis would collapse in themselves in the same way the Soviets did towards the end of the Cold War. Is that true? Let's see. The main reason that the Soviets collapsed were that they were clunky. The Central Politburo couldn't handle the economic and social life of the empire in the same way the dispersed capitalist system could. The American government did more by doing less. This would not be a major weakness for the Nazis. The Nazis had businessmen run the economy fairly unfettered. Hell, they'd give them slave labor to make them even more competitive. Nazi artists were allowed to make traditional styles of art, and the officer class of Nazi Germany was probably the best in the world. Germans and probably the other Germanic peoples, like the Danes, Norwegians, and Dutch, would probably have some of the highest standards of living on Earth. So what would Nazi Germany's weakness be? It's racism. Nazi Germany was built upon the oppression of most of the world. The Aryan master race is a small part of the world's population, and couldn't make allies because the ideology was based on them being superior. This would become a much more acute issue as improved health and farming measures would mean that the native populations of areas like Africa and the Middle East would skyrocket. For example, Tanzania had 7 million people in 1950. In 1990, 26 million, and today 60 million. This would result in horrific bush wars across the colonies. The native peoples would realize they were getting more numerous by leaps and bounds, and the Americans would be happy to supply them with assault rifles. European boys would be conscripted to fight endless and tiring wars in the colonies. This would permeate Nazi society itself. Nazi society would remain racist, but the flavor of it would change. Their racism itself would be justified by their success. Was it a coincidence they were masters of the world and their cousins the English and Americans ran the rest? The new generation of Nazis would be born wealthy feudal lords. Unlike their fathers and grandparents who grew up starving in 20s Germany and learned bitterness from the shame of World War I, the Germans of this world would be living in unequivocal success. They would stop hating the Untermenschen. They would start to pity them. Russia and communism were no longer a threat to the Aryan race, but the Slavs would be a pitiable serf class. There would be a drive in later generations to make Nazism with a human face, to make better conditions for the serfs, to shorten the hours of slave factory workers, to improve food. Since they were the master race, wasn't it their job to act like one? What master lets his slave starve? Why was it the Untermenschen's fault they were born in a lesser race? It's kind of like America's baby boomer generation, which was the richest generation in history. In their wealth, they felt secure enough to realize the inconsistencies of their philosophy and ask questions like, if all men are equal under the Constitution, why not blacks, or gays, or women? If this was done at the right time and the right amount, this might prolong the Nazi state, like how becoming capitalist has saved the Chinese Communist Party. However, the liberalization might destroy the system. Decades of oppression unleashed when they were finally allowed to, only held down by the most brutal tactics. This is what happened in apartheid South Africa and Soviet Russia. Like all of history, a slight decision on part of the leadership would determine the fate of the rest of history. Wow. That was the longest video I've ever made, and it took me a while to make. I hope you guys liked it. If you did, please comment, subscribe, support me on Patreon, stay tuned for future videos, and tell your friends if you want. Thank you very much for watching, and have a good day.